didla yang tene ke para chabe ne chu ane chugi tomshi soso yang da ba riba shi an tene gune sungi yoba le tanda kebe ne chu kabla kebe ne chu de la yang ane tangbo phungbo la kebas tene kabla ne de phungbo de la yang phungbo la ena nga yobe nang ne tangbo sugi phungbo de la le de tene sugi phungbo de la yang ane ena 유숙 중화시 안에 제숙 축지 센데 예배 나네 다 제숙 축지 갑lep데 제숙 축지 다 제숙 축지 데라 안에 제숙 축지 다 왕복나 대 슈신 안에 되는가 대 슈신네 안에 제숙 축지 찌디 갈라 최기게체 빠이 속데 지당직당 안에 양 넘버 리제 많이 속지당 니센다 왕봉하다 병하데 주대 휴센다 축지바데라 렙데여 디네 안에 최기 깨체 바이 속나데스
The gateway to knowledge is divided into three main parts. Discussing three main topics. The first one being the 10 topics of expertise, or 10 topics of being learned. Then come the 4 seals of Dhamma, and then the last one are the 4-fold correct discriminations. We are currently discussing the first one of those, the 10 topics of being learned, which starts with the topic of the aggregates, which is further divided into 5 parts. The 5 aggregates. Out of these 5, we're currently discussing the first one, form. And form is further divided into the 4 causal forms, which are the great elements, and 11 resultant forms. And the 11 resultant forms are further divided into the 5 sense faculties, which we have completed, the 5 sense objects, which we have also completed, and then the 11th resultant form, which can either be identified as mental objects or as imperceptible forms. There's actually there are 2 different ways of describing this 11th resultant form. So that is then the topic of today's class. And in our book, in our text, we are on page 19, 1.17, which starts with there are 5 types of forms that are mental objects.
데서 쭉직이 나라 안에 렉자이 콜라다 티와지 레벨에 안디 콜라지 슈나 렉자 초반 용술지 권에 렉자들라 상보 당님바 바르마순 연낭 신들의 진낭성과 안에 다딜라 유레스는 초반 용술지 권에 양 렉자들라 안에 상보 님바 바르마스네 샤나다게 디기레스 베나조 대사 대오 안에 지 내강 야보 세양 야보 딘제스니 요디 갑델라 다디디갈라양 내강당 사마당 안에 대사당 된조기 렉자 된조 잠보 셈라 초르와 안에 이도 홍와 제용데 갑라 다딜라 초르와 상보니도 딱이 요레스 초르와 상보 되네양 아주 갑갑 싱나기라데 대사양 되네 행동경오라데 아니 니마당 롱딘제 망보포 렉자 딘조게 장와당 차와당 딘데 아니 사마양 융세 딘데 정바 사송나 아니 코바낭라 렉자 렉자 마지바 딘데 렘니로와 또바당 딘데 롱게 렉자 슈크shum보 딘데 당공 가상 디발라 주원하시나와 제품 갑라 롱게 렉자 슈크shum보 메지 아니 메 렉자 슈크shum보 딘데 차응디 갑라 tenzu ge re yong de kala yang rekja maji bo tin de chane ane semyang khongdo la so ba tin de le ge re ta de de ma ga ba do chung na de rekja nyem ba taw chi ro ba ane ta ji 양 rekja denni kaya 많이 봐 남유니 자오지 또 찬용 자오지 양나 안데 지기 네슈슈슈 뭐시라 때 마도 된도 되네 바르마 자오지다 데 언더드나 rekja 데라 양네 서로와 용속이 보네 되네 이동와당 명와당 바르마슨 된데 양 샤초기레스.
Before we continue with our text, though, there were a couple of questions from Friday. The first one was with regards to tangible objects or textures. And the question was whether we can also divide tangible objects into pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral, or whether we can divide them according to the sensations that are experienced based on these objects. So whether they're pleasing, pleasurable, whether they're unpleasant or neutral. And yes, we can also divide textures or tangible objects in this way. We can divide them based on which kinds of sensation they cause or that they bring about, which kind of experience of different sensations we have through experiencing them. And an example for that is if we have a really nice place to stay, if we have a really nice bedroom and a good bed, and we eat good food, then these are experiences, textures and tangible objects that actually are pleasant for us, that we experience as pleasant. So all the fabrics that we have around us are very soft, and if we also have good food, so our physical elements in our physical body are in harmony, then this is experienced as pleasure. This is experienced as something nice. But if we were to stay outside in the forest and we have to sleep under trees and we're exposed to the sun and wind all the time, and sometimes it's and sometimes it's hot and sometimes it's cold, and we also don't get proper food. So the inner textures, the inner tangible objects that we experience are also out of balance. As we said yesterday, when there's a lot of wind, then we're feeling hungry. If there's a lot of heat or fire, the fire element is strong, then we will experience thirst and so on. So if that happens because we're in these more challenging circumstances, if we don't have any nice fabrics around us, but we have to sleep rough and so on, then all of these things will be experienced as something unpleasant, as something that's actually bringing us suffering or at least displeasure. And we might even develop aversion based on these sensations. So those would then, all of these textures and tangible objects that create the unpleasant feelings, the unpleasant sensations, would then be categorized as not so nice or as unpleasant. And then if they're textures or tangible objects, which is probably more inclusive than the word textures, that don't bring either pleasure nor displeasure to us through their encounter, then can be identified as neutral. So yes, those are then these everyday things we come into contact with that we don't have any particular reaction towards. And in short, yes, we can also classify tangible objects or textures in light of the sensation that they bring about as they're encountered. So there can be pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral ones.
네. 지원이와 데라 아니 속통도 소소교기 당 아니 박배 통당 개발 간대 요래서는 되게 승리는 난디데라 송년당 이제 속면 가우치 답변나 니가기 분바 통디갈라 니가기 분바 통디라와 다 소소교육의 분바대 다 속통디갈라 니가기 분바 자우로 통기를 이나야 다디 삼록이 진당기 군에 삼로 땅나 덴바 주바니도 진바당 덴바 마주바니도 진바선 된조 계자 된조 양다 삼로 카가다오라 다 미기 속통디 다 단다 지당기 계자데 시고라 단다 두루 조다 켄주다 당보 되는말라다 속이 풍보 콜라 계제시디 갑라 다 계제 남샤 신신데서 가야만에 지단기 계제시디 갑라다 통당 니자기 속 직바직바다오 통기레스 다 딜라양지 식당기 군에 개발 샤나니다 덴바르 좁다 마좁당 주마다 미남다오 통다 마통당 아니 제 장신 마주바니도 통계 요매 딘도데다 라난 소속이다 박바 당 소속이 라난 소속이다 이제 따와기 보니 다딘데데 샤초브리나 지당직 분바 잠직라다 니자기 분바 세계 요양 박바 인생양 분바기 또 디르와 샵shum 쳐줄 던전 누바데 마시네 아니 배트코론 똥바니 다우지 경경지 식데 가야 만낭와 다우지 베나 똥바니 세나미도데 가야 마통 나랑족이 통교 낭신 많이 바 신바지 통해로 된데다 믹세 가 요지 말레스 분바랑 통교 이제 다디 주바데 디 있나니 다양 삼로 진당데 간데 증기레스네 람나타 소소교에나 덴바르 주바기 분바니도 당 파바 넘바스나 덴바르 마주바 데메기 분바니도 시와다오 소소교 된조기 문에 니람데라 문에 따도 송와당 파파 된조였나 니람 따도 송와라야도 다 된조 숑침보 시바 숑데조나 양디 남주 식당지 레베라 다운데로 계세요 단다지 지당기 계좌에 있는데 니자기 분바 세기레스
The second question that came up was with regard to form and how it is perceived by ordinary beings or by noble beings. So what is the difference between the perception of form by ordinary beings and noble beings? And there's a general explanation how it is this topic is treated in all sorts of different texts and so on, that speaks about seeing form as either form, actual form, or as a reflection, and that kind of distinction. Now, we have to distinguish between, or there are different ways that we can relate to this. Here, the question is there actually a difference between perceiving the vase itself, an object itself, between the normal person, an ordinary sentient being, or a noble being? The actual perception of the the object as we have described it here in the Gateway to Knowledge, in the Abhidhamma context, where we speak about the aggregate form and visible form, etc., then is one way of looking at it. The whole discussion of how it is held, how it is grasped through or not, is another discussion. So the way that it is perceived and then apprehended is actually different. There we have the discussion of, or the explanation that ordinary sentient beings grasp to these phenomena that appear as being truly established, while noble beings know them to not be truly established. But here, just in the context of the sense objects and the sense faculties, that's actually the same for ordinary sentient beings and noble beings. There's no difference in the act of the perception itself, the act of, or the perception itself of the sense faculty coming into contact with the sense object. The difference then really lies in whether what is perceived is grasped to as being truly established or not, whether it is considered to be established in its own right, by its own nature or not, whether it's perceived to be of an empty nature or not. So the mere appearance that one has is not different. So it's not that an ordinary sentient being would see the vase, just a vase, with its color, shape, and all these distinguishing features, and then it would appear completely different to to a noble being, that there is nothing at all that appears to the noble being, or that it somehow completely changes its appearance in the sense of just the appearance itself. But the difference really lies in how one relates to it afterwards, whether one grasps to the appearance as being truly established or not. Or another way of describing that in some of the great philosophical texts is then to liken it to holding a dream to be true, or holding it, or knowing that the dream is just a dream. That's where the difference lies, but not in the process that we're describing with the sense faculties and the sense objects.
지와카가데 풍보당 안에 풍부이나라도 양내주대 안에 냠nen지당데 간데이나 안데 양 민실라 펜당 간데이나 양나데 가장소 냠nen 강남은 믹스에 되도 매와지네 된 시작이 롭종다우지 정해 잠지 이낭 안데 간데라 이낭 센테네시티 와시도 단데라야 안에 다 냠nen 강라도에 여바레스 롭종은 여바레 롭종 시에네 롭종데 되네 수수기 셈통강나다지 냠nen 강라양지 랑랭양 도에 여레스 랑랭라 간데 도에스나 변나 풍부라 차샤나 단다데 가상 양숭레 케빈네주 데 던괴 던다데 가리인스나 케빈네주데 숭괴기 던다데 다도 따바 추생지 도에게 치도라 인스 다데 숭사라 가상 약강라 데인두 변나 풍부라 안에 케바 차송나 안에 간데 중기레스 라데칼라 다 직부로 짐바 생인데 독일에서 말해 케바 세리가라 칙레 케바당 돈라 케바니 칙라데 장바치 돈라데 되네 삼로망보 땅 냠린치 돈나 되네 케바 창이라 데인두 벤나 나론소 단다 난 남들 냠린치디 갈라 되네 양 벤나 풍보데 벤나 나이 풍보데 나이 수보데 나 생인데 칙이나 삼송데 나이 수보데 단다 풍보 걸라 깨져 송도 스캔주나라 수기 풍보 생활한주 수부지도 초로와 아니 초리 풍보 아니 두제 남셰 덴데스네 망보지 초교지래도 나승인데 chik yin nang mi nang samne dine o di yin de sam dinde samne ta zo chewa phungbo de nga redu wa dero samlo yang yang korna ta di negam nyamlin res di de ta nyamlin na rimba mangbo yore wa ta tanda dak chik pur zo tambo ngela tanda duru nyamlin jidang da kandira phungbo la nga yore das pecha shana zo phungbo nga redu sen changa kya phungbo nga duwa dinde sam ane 다는 신 되네 속이 풍부라 양 되네 카도단 일단 된데 레도 선된데 망보시네 망보지 십십 망보 땅디 갑라 되네 최 탐제 찍부르 덴버드 버즈마 시장 아주 단다 뺀나 점링승데 찍 인사레 점링 딱바 공부 릴부 찍 인사레 삼나다 찍 레도 레미도 돼 뺀나 레레레 에와체네 따여라 보라 어디 나신체네 다 딤 낭로라 에와체네 인데스네 샤나 되네 진짜제도 봐 난내 주 된조 심바 된조 양 되네 다도 따와 레레레레레게 도에게 님볼라 인송한테 되도 냠래야 요래 롭숑야 요래 아니 메실라 펜 통야 된다 용게레스
And another question that came up was that with regard to practice. So when we study the aggregates and so on, when we study the 10 topics of expertise, how does this relate to our practice? How can we use this in our practice of the Dhamma? How does it benefit our life or our practice? Or is it really just something we need to study to gain the knowledge of it? No, it is. So the answer is that it is very related to practice. Yes, you have to study it and gain the knowledge of it, but that will also inform your practice. The study of the 10 fields of expertise and or knowledge and so on, they all directly relate to practice and our practice in itself. And how is that? It is, as we have already spoken about at the beginning. Actually, when we take just the aggregates as the example, the aggregates as well as the other 10 topics of knowledge are taught in order to counteract the 10 mistaken views of the self. So each of the 10 topics counteracts a particular mistaken idea of how a self would exist. Taking the aggregates now as the example, if one becomes knowledgeable in the aggregates, and that means if one becomes knowledgeable both in the words and the meaning of the explanation of the aggregates. So if one understands the words, but one also understands the underlying meaning thoroughly, then a view of the self to be singular is going to be counteracted. So by studying the explanations and then also thinking about it, so coming to a conclusion about the meaning of what one had studied, by thinking and contemplating it thoroughly, then any kind of notion that there would be a singular self will be eliminated or gradually reduced and eliminated. So if one has this idea that there is a singular self, then one asks oneself where the self lies. It has to do with the 5 aggregates. Our experience of being has to do with the 5 aggregates. So we then identify that there is a body and then also the sensations, perceptions, formations, and the consciousnesses. And if one studies the aggregates like that, one sees that there are 5 aggregates. There's not a singular self that constitutes our experience, but these multiple parts to it, these 5 different parts. So there's not one self, there's not a singular self. And then each of the aggregates can be further classified, further analyzed. And one goes deeper and deeper and dissects them further and further, classifies them more and more. Then one can come to, through contemplating that, one sees that there cannot be a singular self. So it's through the contemplation of the meaning of the aggregates that actually the mistaken view of a singular self will be reversed, will be counteracted. And the same kind of analysis can also be applied to other things. For example, if we have the idea that the world is singular, that there's one singular thing that is the world, then we can also break that into parts, thinking about different components that make up the world, and further classify and identify smaller and smaller parts until we lose the idea that there is one singular thing that in itself.
Namru.
We lose the idea that there would be one singular world, one singular thing that actually exists as a singular thing that would be the world. So each of the fields, the topics of knowledge, of being learned, actually functions as the antidote to different mistaken ideas of how there could be a self. So in this way, it's incredibly relevant to practice because it's a way to contemplate and reverse all grasping to a self.
최기 깨체비 수 나데스 드네 다 제속 축직 드네 말라 드고드 드네 다추데 왕봉아도 병아도 다 축지바 페나 최기 깨체비 수 셰와 되네 간데 인세나 이기 요도 유르베나 최기 깨체비 수스 다데 디 수디 양 야강라 단다 된가 있는라 조베기 속되데 말에 다데 믹시에게 송자를 주르와다 말에 추기 깨체스나 얘기 송자를 주르와 얘기 요도 주르베기 소레스 딜라이나 양나여스 추기 깨체 바이 속나여스 때 당보데 두발레 주르바셰 둘타랍게 속네스 다 두발레 주르비 속 생지여스 두발레 주르바 두바스 두바 망보츠 두바스 다 라파 된조 좀 시리 주르바스 딜렘블은 두바스 다 망보츠 라파 페나 붐바도 라파 된조 좀 얘기 시도 지게베나 고 두바스 두발레 주르비 셰바스 둘타랍게 속데스 다 둘타락이 속되라 라이도와 디 속인장세 얘기 셰파르자와 잠모스 다디 속레다 말에서는 속레스 이나양 디 얘기 셰파르자와 잠시레스 디 나랑조 수수기오 타말와기 투몽기 얘기 송와 잠시레스 디 수수기오 타말와 된적이 미기 송기 마레스 디 수수기오 타말와 된적이 아니 얘기함 셈기 송와 잠시 레스 다디 야 된가 있나라 숙조와 단다 카도기 숙당 입기 숙세네 된데스네 된조 제뎀 간 말에도 송래 다디디 얘기 송절 교바레스 다디 둘차랍데라 계제시레 인교 둘차랍데스 둘차랍데 수수기오기에다 메기 송토기 말에스 송교레
Okay, now we move back to our text, and we are currently now discussing then the mental objects. So we've completed the sense faculties and the sense objects, and now we have reached the mental objects. And those are identified as the 11th kind of form, as they do not fall into the category of either of the other of any of the other objects. So they do not fall into the category of any of the sense objects, because they are not the objects that are perceived by the sense faculties, but rather these mental objects are the objects for the mind faculty. And so they do not fall into the category of any of the other resultant forms. But as they are actually perceived or conceived of by the mind faculty, then they're also identified as objects, as forms, in the sense that they're the object for the mind faculty, or the object of the mind. And there are 5 types. The attendance question for today: how many airplanes are we gonna hear? Or how many airplanes are gonna disrupt our class? So there are 5 types of mental objects. And the first one of those is here said to be deduced forms, are the forms of the smallest particles, which, although physical, can only be known mentally. So these deduced forms, or the infinitely small forms, or these forms are forms that are the building blocks for other forms, for course experience. So they are actually only the object of the mind faculty, because they cannot be perceived by the sense faculties. They cannot be perceived by the eye, ear, and so on, by the eye faculty, ear faculty, and so on. But there are actual forms. They are actual particles. It's just the fact that an ordinary sentient being cannot directly perceive them with their sense faculties. Too subtle, too small, cannot, and therefore cannot be perceived. So the only way for them to arise in the mind is through deduction, through mentally breaking down more coarse phenomena, and then the idea of the smallest indivisible particles, or the identification of the smallest indivisible particles, can arise in the mind. So smallest particles are not an object of our sense faculties, but through analyzing and breaking down the more coarse objects, the certainty, or the smallest indivisible particles, can be deduced by the mind, and therefore they arise as the object of the sense of the mind faculty. And so that's why, even though they physically exist, they're still an object of them. They're still mental objects, because they cannot be perceived directly by the sense faculties of an ordinary sentient being.
Hai Migdang Ani Salanebe Changju Sembatang Sanje Namgi Das Mixige Sigi Yores, Das Signayang di Kongnambuto Sigbala Tene, Ani di Da Yakangla Tandangazo Miki Sungjar Jube Sugjimba, Ondi Nangla Shako Samna Tidesh Shatu Mare Tanda di Tanda Kapto Keja de Kariresana, Susukyo Tamalwa Tenzuki, Migi Tegar Sungtuki Mes. 소소교 타말와 대조기 얘기 숭자리 교와 인스람네 다디 콘돌라 샤고베레스 지당기 다양 속 차와데 다 하이 믹당 아니 살라네베 장주스만 남기다 시기여레스 다 시나야 양 디데 미키 숭자리 주베 속 임바탈 파과 남지 시위에 치르스 파과당 데네 하이 믹든 조기 통위 치르스 남나 다디 지기민도스 다디 단다 조데 소소교 시샤게 원불 당네 숭바레스 디엔디 얘기 시작하기 율다 줄바 인스 수수께우기.
These smallest particles, they can actually be directly perceived by someone who has gained divine vision or by the bodhisattvas that abide on the bhumis and Buddhas. So they can actually be directly perceived through these exalted ways of perceiving. Now, one might ask whether this qualifies then as a reason to identify them as visible forms, as we did previously, whether it belongs to the category of visible forms. But actually, no. Only
Namrules.
It's the first time that we have that many airplanes in many months. So I'm not used to it anymore. I get distracted. So we cannot place them. We cannot place these smallest particles into the category of visible form based on the fact that some exalted ways of perception can directly perceive them. So because bodhisattvas and Buddhas can perceive them. But the basis of the analysis here, or the basis for distinguishing them, is in the perception of ordinary sentient beings. So it does not necessarily imply that because someone can perceive them, some exalted beings like the bodhisattvas and Buddhas and those beings who have attained to divine vision could perceive the smallest particles. That does not necessitate that these particles are visible form, but the distinguishing feature to classify them as visible form or as an object, a mental object here, is the perception of an ordinary sentient being, an ordinary person without any particular exalted vision. So here this distinction is made based on whether or not ordinary sentient beings can perceive the smallest particles or not with their eye faculties, and they cannot, and therefore it falls into the category of mental objects.
네, 수수교에다 얘기 시에바데 간데 얘기 시에고레스 간데 시에고레스나 벤나디로 슈우제나 디 둠부니라우소나 라파인디 칼랑아서 통투그레 당봉에라 둠부니 소나 디 니라서 양 둠부니단 둠부직데 샤나 양디 둠부니도소 양 통투그레 다 제라 차로 땅나데 다 충도 땅이라 돈 충도 땅다 갈려 간삼 제라데 마통마로 다 충종 돼 도다 짤 카짤 제 타마 되네 저 미기 통마도네 되네 제라 셈게 다 충종지 여다 여래 이나양이 미기 통다 토마송 다도다 딜레 에와치에 여러와 어딘데스네 락바데 에와치와기 중신라 충도 좋아하기 균신라 때네 딱고 충도 땅네 다 충쇼지 열에 습니다 딱대 균신데 가르려서는 몰라 충도 땅에 돼요 여러분 돈 충도 땅 어디 카잘해야 돼 다디기 로바체네 데 균신라 때네 다 차와지 요바데 셈게 하고 그래서 얘기 시작을 잡아 잠모스
How can we know that these smallest particles are then objects of the minds of ordinary sentient beings? Or how can they be known? How can the mind consciousness perceive them? Actually, if we have a piece of paper, then we can divide it into two pieces. And then we can divide one of these pieces into yet another small, like we can cut them or tear them in half again and again until we get smaller and smaller pieces of paper. And in the end, we will come to a point where we cannot perceive the parts of the paper anymore with our own eyes, but we know that there must be parts of the paper present because all that we did was tearing or cutting the paper in half. So there must be something left. There must be little pieces of paper, even though they are not visible to our eye faculties anymore, even though we cannot perceive them anymore, we cannot see them anymore because they're too tiny, they're too small, too subtle. And so because we know that there was a more coarse phenomena, there was a bigger piece of paper in the beginning, and then all we did was cutting it into halves, and the half into half, and the half into half, and the half, and so on, then this is the sign, this is the reason based on which we deduce that there must be these smaller or smallest particles that we come down to by breaking up the paper more and more. But we cannot see them with our eyes anymore. So at a certain point, they turn into a mental object, an object that we know of only through the deduction, through knowing that it comes from bigger pieces.
Ngumbar kabyo pam salwane gong she tar shen la ani meto pawos ta ngumbar kabyo be sukde tanji khasang ya gang la ji kechale wa nang shin re san sumare da de gong du she ba ta lo shen la meto pawos shen la rekba dang ani dral de yo barwa pannang kya singe thongwa de la da de 다딜라지 인주디아 얘기 시작하기 시작을 했습니다. 다 야강들라 양변나 왕복이 짜승의 통일간에 야강라 미기 송자리 교회 대라 샤라와 양 단다 두루데 아니 두루양 얘기 송자리 대라 샤바래 다디데 조데다 왕복라 짜승의 능의 차는 양 미기 송자 저죠 나양 안에 숙문에 따오기 남주인이 통해 자우기 남주인이 가와 공부라서 받아 숙신도 통화는 신기 되는데 숙매위 비차는 양 뭐버 꺄승에 통화되라 양 수오스는 셈기지 다시 숙스나미도 되다 지금 뭐버 꺄승에 독선이 랍네 다지 셈기 다디 아 요와도지 셈기 삼네 다디 아니데 단다디 추기 계책이 때문에 얘기 쉐비 숭에기 제라 샤인사레 인주 두루다다 강음버캅 요밤 살와니 공셰 따르 공도 쉐바낭신 인수 숭샤도라
The second of the 5 types of forms that are mental objects reads then spatial forms or clear forms are forms that cannot impede other things as explained above. So we have already seen the discussion of spatial forms above as an object of the eye faculty. And here it refers to the same object, it refers to the same thing. And we said that spatial forms refers to the absence of anything tangible, the absence of anything obstructive. So it's the empty space between obstructive things. So the empty space between those obstructive obstacles or obstructive forms like a pillar and the vase, and there's empty space in between all these tangible objects, all these obstructive objects. And we looked at this previously in context of visible form as something that the eye actually beholds in some way. So that it is actually something that we see as the absence of anything obstructive. Here now, it's also listed as a mental object because it is actually something that the mind comes to a conclusion about. It's the mind that identifies this empty space as an actual object, thinking, okay, there must be a thing that's called a space. There's a thing there's a form that is the absence of anything obstructive. So it's not the same kind of perception as the perception of a pillar or a vase, but it's to identify the absence of those other kinds of forms as being a form is a conclusion that the mind comes to, and therefore this is as form, as an object, it actually arises to the mind faculty.
yang dakwar langba la jungwa ne number reche mai be source yang dakwar langba le jungwa source ta de number reche mai be source yang dakwar langba de so na de number reche mai be source ta de ong ne mala salbo je sungi do yang dakwar langba le jungwa source ne dai je kare suk kawa pumba la so ba sunga na shin chi ne te daw ge number river chewa maimbe suk sos tadi ma on tos ge ba legire.
The third type of form that is a mental object is then forms resulting from a taken promise are imperceptible forms. These imperceptible forms will be discussed in some more detail below. But the example for that is, what illustrates that is having correctly or properly taken a promise or a vow, and that results in some type of form. It's not a form like the form of a pillar or a vase, but it's a different kind of form. So it's an imperceptible form that arises from having properly, correctly taken a vow or a promise. But we will see that in some detail below.
네, 네, 제가 군답의 속네, 군답의 속 시와되니 가인스나 이제 지금 두발의 주비수, 원바르카의 속 니바 양다 랑발의 준수, 니바 숨바치 시와 군답의 속 군답의 속 생인데는 송년당 밀람지 속 따오스 군답 군도 따와 속 원에 많이 나양 셈제 아니 속 원에 레스는 삼샤바데 데라 군답이 속스다 송년다고 인세페나 멜롱게 남게 송년데 군답이 속레스 다 멜롱게 남게 속 송년데라 아니 제 멜롱게 낭 셜고된조 인데 낭라다가도나 요 마레라 데니 칠로라 요 마레라 아니 가발라야 요 마레 지 따제당나 데니 메나 양지 코롱 요 도도 러치네 문네지 북라 아니 숭년데 아니 문네 숭지요와 더우치네 통계요란 데디 당하는 쪽에 쑥 문네지 도스네 파 따샤게요레스 밀람게 남신데 밀람 남라 다 지금 그만나라 냐를 대비까지라 랑고체당 되니 강바당 지신 낙살 강당 강된조 낭나양 네 셈기 당 문에 랑고체요 문에 지신 낙살도요 된데스네 셈기 파 따샤요 군도 따바스 군도 따바기 소레스 얘나양 문에 고롱 되네 강반낭라 랑체당 아니 네 지신 낙살당 강바당 어떤저 지 지신 나사 링가당 어떤저 여르베서나 안된정문에 가요 요 말에 셈기 봐요 도도 시셔디 셈기 요도도 지네 셈기 되네 심바를 쳐봐 어떤저데 군답을 수스
After having covered deduced forms, spatial forms, and imperceptible forms, the fourth kind of form are then the imagined forms. Imagined forms are such things as a mental image or dreamt forms. Actually, it's more like would rather translate it as reflections or forms in dreams. So imagined forms or forms that are completely mentally created, they are these kinds of forms that are not real. They're not really existent, but the mind takes them as real. So they're not real forms, but the mind grasps to them to exist in the way that they appear. And so, for example, the reflection that we see in the mirror is one of these kinds of forms. The mirror reflects a form, but the mind thinks that there is an actual form in the mirror. But no matter how much we investigate, the form is not to be found inside the mirror, behind the mirror, around the mirror, apart from it just being a reflection of what is in front of the mirror. So the mind grasps to the reflection to exist as a form in itself, while there's really no form inside the mirror, or the reflection itself is not a form, but the mere reflection of the actual thing, the actual form in front of the mirror. So there the mind just grasps to the reflection itself to exist while it does not really exist. It looks like form, but it is not form. And because it looks like form, the mind thinks it is form, but it's not. Another example is are the forms that arise in dreams. So when we're sleeping, nicely in our beds, in our rooms, then in our dream we might see all sorts of things. We might see elephant, forests, houses, all sorts of different things. And in our dream, we think that these are real, that the forms that we perceive are actually real. But they're not. They're mere apparent dream experiences. So there's no real elephant in our room. There's no forest. There's no house that is actually there, but it's just perceived in the dream. So again, the mind grasps to these appearances to be really there while they're not, and therefore we call them these imagined forms that are only the object of the mind faculty of they're just mental objects rather than actual forms, because they do not exist as actual forms.
데젤라 왕주르위 나바데 왕주르위 소세 왕주르바스나 랑셈라 왕주르바스 랑기셈라 왕주르바스 왕주르위 소데네스 간데스나 삼텐라 왕주르위 토기스 삼바템보 치네 데네 삼바템보 치네 데나 데네 셈라 삼바템보 치베 데네 셈라 왕 라왕 톱네 디기 톱게 나미수 Peshashana, Separangumbo la Sopataos, Sum de Separangumbos, Suk Separangumbo town, Nangmi Suk, Separangumbo Taos. Ane Nuju Tamje Katongumbuki Rangshin, Send the Samba Tempo, Chinitena, Ane Tamje Mumbo Nido Nangwa, say Wang Jurbi Topke, Semla Wang Jurbi Topke, Mumbo la Sopala Nangwa. Thing is in that thing is in Sim Sechitu, Netena. 다나시 뉴주 탐제 매랑신 임모 삼네데 매 넘버 곰 매낭신 삼네데 삼바 템보 제네 되나 되네 셈라 매랑신도 짱짱 곰투에게 왕조르베 아니 매 수수 나와세 다나시 추당 아니 추니도 곰바 다나시 남칸니도 곰바 어 텐데 용데 갑데라 난주르바데라 곰 잡겐 강사데라 네 뇌주 탐제 가동 음복의 낭신라 쑥 탐제 아니 이제 음복이랑 신라 세네 아니 쑥 심바 춘다 카르보 마르보 당 쑥 심바게 입 통계만 음복랑 신라 세네 디강라 디경경 디바시 낭네 로와 음복 바시 낭네 어딘데 신이 통해 그 쑥쉐라 디 쑥데라 왕주르비 쑥라게 다 디안 추기게 제바이수 디 이기 숭자르 줄바레스 디 미기 숭자르 줄바데 다 강사레르르르 난 초게레데 이나 지당지다 디다우기 쑥된조데 얘기랑 신기들레스 나브레
The next form is then type of form is then mastered forms. Mastered forms are forms appearing through the power of mastery and meditation, such as the totality of blue. So the mastered forms are something that it can be perceived by a trained mind, a mind that is very stable in meditation, and so gains independence, gains control over what it perceives, and then can perfectly focus on that. So the example for that is the totality of blue. And so a meditator or yogi can focus the mind and can gain the control over the mind to see all appearances, all forms as just blue, so that everything that they see is of blue color. And they can do so by focusing, by controlling the mind in this specific way with the one-pointed stable concentration. The totality of blue is just one example. They can also focus on everything to be of the nature of fire. So then all forms appear as fire. This ability to perceive everything as blue, or the ability to perceive everything as fire, is a result of very stable meditative concentration, or a very stable mind that has really gained mastery of what appears to it, of what it perceives. Of course, there are also other things that they can perceive. They can meditate on everything to be water, or everything to be like space, and then that is the actual appearance that they perceive. So when the yogi or the meditator gains this mastery over his or her mind to see everything, all forms, as being blue, then they have gained the mastery that they won't perceive any other color forms. For example, they won't perceive anything red or white or yellow, but they only perceive everything as blue. And so that kind of perception, that kind of form that arises to the mind faculty, the totality of blue, is not what the eye faculty actually perceives. It is what the mind faculty of this very trained person perceives. So it's only the object of apprehension of the mind rather than of the sense faculties. And this is not to say that there might not be some few individuals who have some selective vision in terms of colors, but generally this appears only to the meditator who focuses the mind one-pointedly on such an object, like the totality of blue. It's not the object of generally of the sense conscious, the sense faculties.
대 소타고 세 왕주르베 속다오 왕주르베 속다오 셈 코네 톱기 낭와라네 돌진 삭바 메베 데이치르 그 중화 시남 마인데스 유데 중화 시남 마인데스 델레 셴베 최기 깨체베 속레 속신 이 왕도 제네 gyur seta wangjurbe sukde zo wangjurbe sukde ta sem khone topge sem tinge jing ge an sem la rawang wangjurba topge nangwa res ta dila chiro la ngarang zo danda dul tharap danda chige sa chu me lung dendo gi dul tharap dende sakpa la mebe chiris ane digi gyude ane chiloki tanda pena kawa da pumba gi gyudenzo pena chiloki juchungwa sachu melong denzo imba nang shin chine dindesene chiloki gyuchungwa shinam maindes.
Mastered forms, it is taught, appear solely due to the power of mind and are not a conglomerate of particles. Their substance is therefore not the elements, but is said to be substance in the sense of a physical form different from them, from the four elements. So these mastered forms then, they are different than other kinds of forms, that are different than the forms that we perceive with our sense faculties, because they are something that is only perceived by the mind that is one-pointedly focused, has gained this mastery of meditative absorption. And so this appearance does not arise based on the coming together of the more subtle particles or of the four elements, the causal forms of earth, water, fire, and wind, but the appearance only arises based on the mastery that has been gained in meditative absorption. So in that way, the forms, the mastered forms, are different than other forms, other kinds of resultant forms, in the sense that they're not resultant from the four elements, but appear due to the mastery of meditative concentration.
요 중화 첨보 셴 딜레 속이 왕도 전에다 최기 계체 바이 속스 안데 셰바인스 송아레도.
So their substance is therefore not the elements, but is said to be a substance in the sense of physical form, different from them. So, yeah, as I just said.
Tene di chela yang ji number riche main be suk de ko la yang ke cha sung do number riche main be suk ne chitar yin chen chenas dini domin pardon sum tope lunga ki le shigla labius tatila ane domba number riche main be suk sing de candidates na dumi pardon sum le tope lunga ki le shigla labius tate domba sedika la pena anzo je soso tabi domba do ani something mangbo komsungna yang something ki komba tame bitun mangbo komsungna yang tame bitun same ki dombas tapena soso taba domba do chashana pena de je kenyin ki domba do ro kiwi shinyin ki dunla cha salwa tang solwa deba tang tene kyamdo shuwa tang tene kiwi shinyin ki maala tene je kenyin ki domba nam yongdi kabla tene songne ala kansa deki gyula ta je
Gonda keranki kedet chetrosa.
laso tanda dwe
Gimido.
o
Tata go give sabe.
laso tanda duel tanda yena
Tata and keranki part that's chichina tagate that's kiwacha inside.
laso
Tata tsule.
laso je te domba sena pena domba shiwa de pena je soso tharpa domba rike tau pena kenye je domba tau shuna pena je lama tun la cha sum chal solwa de kene kyamdo chedu che tene lama ge gyang ma je kyapsu dowa sowa temne tene kyapsu dosong sambe bone tene thama dela tene kyamdo dumba tende sne kenye dumba thoba yin tende sungwa ne sungne tene kansa de gyula ta ane dumba de yedera kenye dumba ti na shin ke rab du jungwa den zola yang tene kelong kesul ke dumba shune ane cha salwala soba igone korong choga lalen de dosa vichela thama ane choka langnen de drupsong na gangsa de gi gyula susu tabi dumba yori tene samden tangbo niwa sumba de la lep thuna samden kom thuna samden kombe top ge samden ki nyamne yobala tene samden gi dumba top de yore tame bi tun same gi tun de kom thuna de top ge de gyula dumba yores ta denzo mingla yang number rikche maimbe sus number rikche maimbe so number rikche maimbe sus number rikche maimbe sus na ane domin se ta domin se na kande jala yin se na pecha shana nam shishi badula tene sokcho par chawo sne tinde se kenen china domin thokre semla domin thokre kansa de la domba maimba thokre dawa oti desne rowa ta pardom sena ne nima chui ringla sha misa sene lamna parme domba thok ru kansa dela nima chui ringla ani yang sok chu ge yin sen lamna yang pardom thok ru des oti desne dom me pardom sum ge thobi gone te lunga ge thobi te lunga ge le ta chawa de rote na kandar yang tidu ani number rikche maimbe sus.
Now we will see a little bit more about the imperceptible forms. How can something imperceptible be a physical form? Imperceptible form is defined as physical form because of these three reasons. Imperceptible form is an action of body or speech after having obtained a virtuous vow, an unvirtuous vow, or a vow with limited time span. It does, however, not consist of cognition because it is continuously present at times of distraction or the absence of cognitions. So, why do we identify imperceptible forms as form? What do they refer to? As we have seen, the imperceptible forms are forms that result from taking a promise or a vow. And so, due to those refer to the actions of body and speech after having taken a specific vow. Here in particular, it speaks about the virtuous vow and unvirtuous vow, or vows with limited time span. Virtuous vows refer to, for example, the 8 vows of individual liberation. So from the lay vows to the vows of renunciance. And so, for example, if one takes the lay vows, the vows of a householder, then one first decides that one wants to do so, goes into the presence of a teacher who can bestow those vows upon one, then one engages in the physical actions of prostrations, and then one will go for refuge, reciting the refuge verbally, and then develop the confidence in the mind that one has actually achieved or has obtained refuge. And then one can take the vows of a lay person, and with one has obtained them, with the confidence that one has obtained them, then from that moment onwards until one dies, one will have these vows. The same holds true for the vows of renunciance, so the novice vows or the vows of full ordination. And so after having done this physical and verbal actions of taking the vows, the imperceptible form is the form that remains as long as one upholds the vow. Another kind of virtuous vow is a vow something that holds one, that is upheld that is obtained by practicing meditative concentration. So if one achieves the different stages of meditative absorption, the 4 dhyanas, then from that, due to the achievement of those stages of meditative absorption, one also then upholds a certain kind of seal or a certain kind of vow, something that binds one through that meditative concentration. Another one are the undefiled vows, which are those that arise or what binds one in the undefiled state, which comes through the realization of selflessness, through meditating, cultivating selflessness, and so on. So all of these are the binding factors that stay with one through having first obtained them, either through one's verbal and physical actions. Then unvirtuous vows then refer to vows and promises that one makes, where one promises, for example, that from now onwards until the time that I die, I will do these and these negative actions, like, for example, I will kill on a daily basis, or those kinds of negative vows. And then there are also the vows with limited time span, where one promises to engage or not engage in something for a limited time span. For example, if we promise that we won't eat any meat for 10 days, or that would be a positive, a virtuous vow with limited time span, compared to I will engage in killing daily for 10 days. That would be then a negative one. And so all of these vows, they exist as as physical and verbal actions after the act of making the promise or taking the vow.
Tene je yingwa dang sim mebe kapswa gun ma che par yebe sim je duwa minba dang je da domin de ane namju ne je de domba dang domin parnung ko la samlo ma dang na yang yeng de ga la samlo kangju mangju kha dang de ka ina da do yang sem me be nekap sin sem me be nekap nga thamba chi edu sem me be kap suang san sem me be kap de la nekap nga do pena ta ma ho ne leb gi ra du she me pa sin ane du she me be kang la nyom par ju pa ane ko bi nyom ju sin ane yang je shiwa de ane ni khu pa sira nga wa de ane temba kyalwa jeme cha song wa da pena o tinde dati duche meba ta duche mebe nyumju kopi nyumju sene mao ne salbu legire ta ni kuwa san azo namju nyal te war ane kapka ngazo jeme thorgira wa o tinde si kapla yang tati number che maimbe zukde ta domba dan domin pardon sumbo tenzo de ngarang chola yo de gyore se kapsuwa gun ma che par yo bes kese semki duba yin song na ane pena chi gyal dewi kabla, ni kubi kabla Tini di sem mebe ne kap tenzo yorwa pena di tuishe mebe nyumar chukwa tendo kap la yang ta sem de kaak chukwa yorwa sem tenzo tos namyu ni sembon rakwa tang mewa chi ni sem de kaak chukwa tendo ya mewa chakwa tendo chakyo yo ma res sem mebe ne kap la yang yores tati de ne kap ki keparar tauji sem mebe kap la yang yowa tauji ne kap keparar tendo chi tos.
It does, however, not consist of cognition because it is continuously present even at times of distraction or the absence of cognitions. So these vows or these imperceptible forms, they are not of purely mental nature. They're not cognitions, they're not mind, because they stay present, they do not subside when one thinks about something else. So once one has taken the vow, then these stay with one no matter whether one thinks about something completely different or there is no cognition of those vows at all in the mind. There are actually different states. There are 5 different states that are identified as being without mind completely. So because it says here, in the absence of cognitions, there are 5 states that identify the absence of cognitions, which are the perceptionless states, the meditative absorption in that is free of perception, the meditative absorption of cessation, then sleep and being unconscious. So in these different states of absence of cognition, so perceptionless states, the meditative absorptions of like perceptionlessness and cessation, or if we're just deeply asleep, or when we lose a consciousness, if we're unconscious, if we in a coma or something, then actually the more coarse kinds of consciousnesses subside. So these kinds of minds subside temporarily, but the coarse, when these minds subside, when these cognitions subside, the vows do not subside with them, and so therefore the vows need to be something different than the consciousness, because they exist even at a time when cognition ceases. So I will stop here for today, and let's do our dedication and the aspiration prayers.
Hoen chambalam bave chidara Bende yang de shen de da kun che zo en da lo en jing ge wa en de da tham je ran du ngo en du sum me shen ben jal wa tham je ye ngo wa kang na chon do nga ba de da ge be za wa en de kwen yang sang bo je chen ran du ngô vā rā jī sū nām dē yé tham jē sē pā nyē tōp nē nyē bē chā nām pām jē nē jē ngā nā jē pā lā yam chū bā yé sē bē tsō lē rō wā rō lō vā rā shō